So welcome to Good Vibrations. We're up to volume 43. Welcome back to all the regulars and welcome to all new listeners. You might want to go back and check out some of the previous volumes. We've covered all kinds of alternative subjects that you don't normally hear talked about elsewhere, from chemtrails to paedophilia in the British establishment, natural law to reincarnation to astral projection, occult symbolism in music, and visual clues in the movies of Stanley Kubrick, to name but a few. We're taking it back to music today, which is, you know, the thing that's close to my heart, and also the guest that we have on. And we're chatting with author and researcher and fellow lifelong music fan and LA dweller, Dave McGowan. Welcome along, Dave.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you, of course, are the writer of the series of web articles that were titled Inside the LC, The Strange but Mostly True Story of Laurel Canyon and the Birth of the Hippie Generation. And we've now got the book, which has just been launched, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, all about the community, the neighborhood in Los Angeles of Laurel Canyon, and some of the stuff that has gone on there in music legend and music lore. So do you just want to start out by telling us what first put you on the path to examining the activities at Laurel Canyon from back in the day?
It was entirely accidental. I've gotten, people that have followed my interviews have probably heard this story way more times than they want to. But, basically I've been, researcher and blogger, whatnot for, since going on 20 years now, since I think my first website went up in 1997. My first book was published in either 99 or 2000.
Okay.
So I've been looking in the dark corners of the conspiracy world for quite a while now, and I'm pretty familiar with a lot of rather dark and ominous topics.
Sure.
And but stumbling upon Laurel Canyon was entirely accidental. I grew up here. I've lived here my entire life. I was born in 1960, so I was a very young lad when all of this played out. I had no awareness of it at the time, but I was geographically right here in the area while it was playing out, but had no awareness of it at all. And anyway, back in 2007, 2008, my daughter had gotten me a copy of Michael Walker's book, Laurel Canyon, which had just come out, brand new in 2007, which was really the first mainstream treatment of the Laurel Canyon scene. And I was very interested to read it and took it with me when I went on vacation with the idea that I was going to get away from all of the stuff that I normally, look into in my day-to-day life. I kind of wanted to just escape all of that and turn off my brain and just kind of roll the clock back. And, I figured this would be the perfect light, beach reading, just, conjure up all these great memories of all this music that really provided the soundtrack to my early years, and
it didn't quite work out that way.
It was, it just was, going to be the perfect escapist entertainment for a vacation. And instead, what I found was that all these alarm bells were going off, and I just could not get through the book quick enough, and just could not wait to get back to my computer and back to somewhere where I could start ordering books and accessing more information on this topic. And, that eventually led to what was initially I envisioned as a very short series of web posts, just kind of an interesting diversion from whatever it was I was working on at the time, which I don't even remember what that was. And instead, it just kind of took on a life of its own, and almost immediately started finding an audience, far beyond anything else I'd ever done, any of the other topics I'd ever tackled previously. This one really seemed to resonate with a lot of people, and and so it just grew and grew and grew, and I started getting feedback from people, and people were saying, hey, have you read this article? Have you read this book? Have you checked out this website? And so with a lot of help and feedback from my readers, it just continued to grow and grow and grow into something that I had never really initially envisioned. And then it eventually reached, book length, essentially. And then I started getting publication offers. Eventually got 3 of them. The first 2 from U.S. publishers who both of whom I just did not really get a good vibe from. I mean, I was very skeptical that any publisher would really handle this material in the way that I thought it should be handled, and I have a hard time turning over control of my material to anyone else, which is why I've been very comfortable working on the web, because I have complete editorial control of my material,
Oh, yeah.
And so I was very skeptical, and I passed on the first two offers, and then ultimately got one from a publisher over on your side of the world in London, Head Press. So now it is a book. And it is contains everything that was in the original series and a whole bunch of additional material. Just lots and lots of a new preface, a new foreword. I think 5 new chapters, a new epilogue, a bibliography, an index, and various augmentations of some of the existing chapters. So
Okay.
it is the very same story, but greatly expanded and augmented now. And a couple people actually have not realized that I'm the same person that wrote the Inside the LC articles, and have kind of accused me of basically stealing. Hey, didn't you steal this story from that guy on the internet?
So the crux of the story is looking at the hugely disproportionate number of artists, music artists and groups that congregated in the Laurel Canyon community towards the end of the 60s, and this is what was termed the counterculture, sort of anti-establishment, birth of the hippie movement, basically. And as I say, there was just a huge number of artists that, for one reason or another, just seemed to flock to that area, whereas legend and lore has it that the hippie movement was birthed up in San Francisco, in the sort of Haight-Ashbury area of that city, which is not really the case, is it?
No, it's not. That's one of the strangest things about this story, is that it's only very, very recently, like I said, Michael Walker was really the first one to do a book-length treatment, and there's been a few others, Canyon of Dreams by Harvey Kubernik, and Hotel California by Barney Hoskins, and some of the work by John Einerson and Richie Unterberger and Barry Miles have touched on it, but still to this day, it's a very downplayed, the whole Laurel Canyon scene. And whenever virtually anyone thinks of the 60s and the hippies and the flower children and that whole music and countercultural scene, their mind immediately goes to Haight-Ashbury, which is viewed as the birthplace and the spiritual center of the whole hippie movement. And yeah, that's one of the great myths, because it actually began down here a couple of years earlier and was a much, much bigger scene, just spawned a mind-boggling number of bands and solo artists that, far more than San Francisco produced, and it was here that, the hairstyles, the clothing styles, all of the things that would become the trademarks of the hippies and the flower children all actually began here. And that, even that aspect of the story is really unknown by even people living, like me and all the people that I grew up with. Nobody, most people in LA, even LA natives do not realize that there was this hugely influential scene here that actually preceded the parallel scene up north.
Yeah. The famous Scott McKenzie song should have maybe been called "If You're Going to Laurel Canyon, Be Sure to Wear Some Flowers in Your Hair," and not San Francisco. That would have been good.
It really, yeah. Because there was this whole vibrant scene there, and just an amazing array of bands. Everyone from the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Arthur Lee and Love, the Mamas and the Papas, the Turtles, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, the Three Dog Night, Captain Beefheart, various bands that Graham Parsons put together, International Submarine Band, Flying Burrito Brothers, a whole bunch of them that I'm leaving out because it's impossible to remember them all. I always leave out a whole bunch of them. Steppenwolf, Alice Cooper, strangely enough,
really
part of the scene. Just people you wouldn't even expect that they don't even quite seem to fit in, as well as just an array of singers and songwriters. Carole King and Joni Mitchell and Judy Collins and Judy Sill and Jackson Browne and James Taylor. And various songwriters before, they kind of made their name for themselves. People like Paul Williams, Warren Zevon, and then in the latter stages, you had all these just giant like super groups come out of the Canyon, like Crosby, Stills and Nash, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Eagles, Fleetwood Mac was it didn't start out there, but became part of that scene when they added Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. And so some of the biggest albums of all time, like the Hotel California and Rumors and CSN's first album, some of the first albums that just went into the stratosphere were products of the Laurel Canyon scene. So hugely influential scene, with just so many artists that to this day are these iconic household names.
Yeah, really.
I think I forgot the Doors, actually. Jim Morrison and the Doors, of course.
Oh yeah.
And and all kinds of others that I'm forgetting. There's just an amazing array of these hugely successful and talented artists that poured out of that scene and really shaped the musical landscape and the cultural, the youth culture landscape for the 1960s, far more so than Haight-Ashbury, which was basically an outgrowth of the initial scene in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah, and the Beach Boys were involved in that as well, you said.
To some extent, they were, yeah. They lived in and around there, and they hung out with the other musicians. Brian Wilson was actually just very, very highly regarded by a lot of the people on the scene. He was pretty much viewed as like the premier musicians, composer, arranger, whatever of that era. Just considered just a massively talented guy, and.
They should have maybe been the Canyon Boys. They should call themselves the Canyon Boys.
Their squeaky clean image doesn't exactly fit with the scene, but they were they were bopping around, and I mean a lot of things about the Beach Boys don't really fit in with their squeaky clean image. Like
Charles
Dennis
Manson
hosting
connections.
Charlie Manson as a house guest for the entire summer of 1968.
There you go. Yeah,
that doesn't quite fit in with their image either.
Not really, no. And where are we picking up the story with all this? We're going back to what, 1964, 65? Would it be?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah, 64, 65. I mean, the first band to really make their mark was the Byrds, who I believe were signed and released their first single circa 1965, which was Mr. Tambourine Man. And they were the trailblazers. They were the ones that really started the whole folk rock, revolution, which then quickly split into several other factions: country rock and psychedelic rock and sort of introspective singer-songwriter genre. And those were all basically pioneered to a large extent in Laurel Canyon.
And so what happened was something drew all these artists and all these collaborators, all these musicians and associates to this particular area, magnet-like. Around about that time, 64, 65 onwards. It doesn't appear to have been an organic, grassroots, natural, creative thing. It seems to be that there was some reason why all these people were being directed to this one particular neighborhood.
Correct, yeah. It happened very, very quickly. I mean, it does not have the look of you think of a sort of organic grassroots movement. You think of these struggling artists, playing coffee houses and maybe getting on college radio and, slowly working their way up to, some kind of mainstream acceptance or whatever. And this didn't happen like that. I mean, these people arrived in town and like within weeks they had fully formed bands and brand new instruments and recording contracts and studio space and rehearsal space. And it just happened so quickly. Yeah. I mean, just like all of these people just over the space of a couple of years, just really just simultaneously congregated on Laurel Canyon, of all places. And people looking at it now will say, well, yeah, of course, LA's the music capital of the country. Why wouldn't they come here? But what people don't realize is that was not the case in the 1960s. New York and the Brill Building and whatnot was still very much the capital of popular music in those days. And
Detroit,
LA.
I guess.
Detroit was the R&B capital. Nashville was country music, and New York was, pop music. Basically, those were sort of the three centers of musical activity in the country. And LA was not even close. It did not have a real vibrant live music scene or recording or recorded music facilities or anything. And that all grew up around Laurel Canyon. The record companies, the music industry moved here because that's where the artists were. Not the other people, think it's probably, they came here because that's where the industry was. No, the industry came here because the artists had all decided to congregate here for no apparent reason.
The question becomes not only why did this happen in LA, but why specifically did it happen in that particular neighborhood, that particular community? Because I don't think there was any kind of rich musical, creative history, sort of bohemian, hippie style history to Laurel Canyon before this period, was there?
No, there wasn't. No. I mean, you look at it, it's a very un-LA slice of LA. If you've ever been to LA, not the most attractive city around. A lot of pavement, a lot of buildings, a lot of concrete.
Yeah.
And Laurel Canyon is very heavily wooded, and it's very very kind of country, bucolic kind of feel to it. I mean, it just looks like a place where hippies would congregate, so I mean, but, the curious part of, one of the many curious parts of it is that it just happened to be the home of a covert military intelligence facility that had been operational there for at least a couple of decades and remained so, officially at least through 1969, and by some reports, well beyond that, but we know that even by official accounts, it was operational till 1969. So through the first 5 years, the key years of this movement, all of these people just happened to be literally huddled around a covert military intelligence facility. So yeah, it makes it a very rather odd place. In some ways, like I say, it's kind of set off from the city. It's very self-contained. It's, it's not even a city itself. It's just a neighborhood within the Hollywood Hills. But it's always kind of had its own feel to it. It's always been sort of self-contained. It's the only canyon that has its own elementary school, that has its own general store, that has other various businesses, and they at one time had their own newspaper and whatnot. So it's just there's only really a couple of ways in and out. So it's kind of geographically isolated, and like I said, very woodsy, and very very self-contained. So in some ways, it kind of makes sense that it would be, because it was basically converted into a giant hippie commune. I mean, if you read the mainstream accounts of Laurel Canyon, they paint this very idyllic, this picture of just this perfect, communal living where everyone had an open door policy, and you could just, wander from house to house watching these future greats, composing these songs that we still hear on, working out these songs that we still hear on the radio today, so, in some ways it made sense, but in other ways it really didn't make sense at all that everybody should just suddenly find themselves in this tiny little isolated geographic area of Los Angeles that happened to house a covert military intelligence facility.
Well, there you go. That's what's going to raise alarm bells with a lot of people, And
that was the first thing that raised alarm bells with me when I was reading Michael Walker's book.
Yeah.
And he just threw that out as an aside, I mean, literally, it was in one sentence in parentheses. He was talking about something else that, this didn't really quite fit the, the peace and love vibe that the canyon was known for. And then in parentheses, he throws in, also not quite fitting the vibe was the covert,
Yeah.
I'm like, yeah, but then he just moves on and never mentions it again. And I'm like, dude,
Exactly.
that's not the kind of thing you can just throw on the table and walk away from.
Yeah, really.
Tell me some more about this, So
Yeah.
those were the kind of things that, I mean, I had a mental list when I got home from the vacation of all the things that I thought I needed to look into, these little things that he was just putting in there as throwaway facts. And I'm like, I think these throwaway facts tell a whole nother story in themselves.
Well, exactly.
There's a whole nother side of the story that's that you're not quite telling us here.
And when you come at it from the perspective of having been a researcher in the sort of conspiratorial field, and you understand how certain things work, you hear about something like a covert military base, and as you say, the alarm bells are instantly rung. And I know that you've done a lot of research into the family backgrounds of a lot of these key musicians. And there's some very interesting things that you can dig up there in terms of what their families did, what many of their fathers did. The most famous example would surely have to be Jim Morrison's father.
Absolutely.
Jim Morrison of the Doors.
You don't find a stranger juxtaposition than that one, I don't think, between father and son.
Exactly.
But, my background definitely helped. I'm kind of a walking encyclopedia of conspiracy facts and figures.
Walk us through the Jim Morrison connection first, and then we'll look at some of the others as well, some of the more interesting
Jim
ones.
Morrison, definitely one of the most unlikely rock stars. Jim Morrison's dad, which had never been reported before it first appeared in my web series in, I think, 2008, was actually the Navy admiral who was in charge of the fleet of ships that was involved in the Tonkin Gulf incident, the notorious Tonkin Gulf incident. He was actually the commanding officer of those ships. And as listeners may or may not know, that was, of course, the incident that led America directly into a ground war, a very bloody and prolonged ground war in Southeast Asia. We had already been involved before that, but that was what provided the justification to introduce ground troops and turn it into a complete bloodbath. And it's been all but officially acknowledged that the incident likely didn't even happen. That the ships never actually came under attack, and
classic false flag.
Classic false flag. And the classic false flag was orchestrated directly by Jim Morrison's dad, and almost simultaneous with him emerging out of Laurel Canyon as this fully formed icon of the anti-war crowd.
Exactly.
So that was a very strange. I mean, literally, it was just like, there's pictures of Jim Morrison seeing his father off as he's about to set sail on the Bonhomme Richard, which is the ship that he was, was the commanding officer on. And there's pictures of him sitting on the bridge of the ship with his dad, and you'd never even know it was Jim Morrison. This real short-haired, clean-cut, very collegiate, conservative-looking young man. Seeing his dad, the admiral, off, and literally months later, his dad's orchestrating the war, and not long after that, this completely different-looking and acting Jim Morrison, comes out of nowhere as this larger-than-life iconic figure. And it was an amazing transformation that he went through in a short amount of time, and just this very bizarre juxtaposition of who the father is and who the son was. And
what did you make of Jim Morrison's death at the age of 27? Have you got any reflections on whether there were any suspicious aspects to that? Because people say that he was like an original member of the mythical 27 Club, all these artists that just happened to die at the age of 27.
Well, I mean, there's a lot of there's a lot of reason to be suspicious about the death of Jim Morrison.
I feel so, yeah.
No autopsy, no viewing of the body. They had it in the ground before they even publicly announced that he was dead. It's like, oh, he's dead, but don't come and try to see the body because it's already in the ground.
Yeah.
A sealed coffin in an unmarked grave in some cemetery in France where it shouldn't be. But, the whole thing was just really weird. And there's been theorizing about it ever since. Was what was the cause of death what it was claimed to be, or did he even die at all? Was it just fake so that he could escape the fishbowl and go on with a different life?
Yeah.
Which I don't really find all that hard to believe, because the guy had shown an amazing capacity to reinvent himself. I mean, he wrote a song called "The Changeling," I think, didn't he? Wasn't that one of the, I mean, if you look at pictures of this guy pre-Doors, and then during the Doors heyday, and then during the latter years when he decided that he was actually a reclusive poet, and put on a lot of weight and, heavy beard and I mean, it looks like three different people, I mean, they don't. It's the pre-Doors, this short-haired collegiate guy, and then the Adonis, Doors guy, and then the latter years, So in just a period of I don't know, 5-6 years, the guy had kind of rebuilt himself 3 times, in 3 completely different personas.
Yeah.
So I don't find it at all hard to believe that he could have done so once again and gone on to whatever it is that he wanted to do. I have no idea, but I don't really find that all that hard to believe, really.
Yeah. What are some of the other family backgrounds that you uncovered? Frank Zappa's is an interesting one, isn't it?
Frank Zappa's a very interesting one. His dad was a chemical warfare engineer, initially assigned to the Edgewood Arsenal, which was not only the home base, longtime home base of U.S. chemical warfare research, but has been implicated repeatedly in various unclassified MK Ultra documents as a hotbed of MK Ultra research as well. And yeah, his dad, Frank Zappa, was actually born at the Edgewood Arsenal. The family lived in housing right there on the base. He went to the Edgewood School. I mean, he lived the first 7 years of his life within the confines of the Edgewood Arsenal. Was born, raised, and educated there for the first 7 years of his life. Which is a pretty curious, background for a rock star to have once again.
For a counterculture artist, yeah.
Yeah, and on top of that, his wife, whose maiden name was Gail Sloatman, who's still alive and very protective of his legacy, from what I hear, by the way. But I've heard she may not be too happy if she gets a copy of my book. But what are you going to do?
It happens.
But she was from a naval intelligence family. Her dad and various uncles and whatnot. She came from a long line of career naval officers, career Navy family, and she actually knew Jim Morrison from 20 years earlier. They knew each other as kids through naval officer circles, and had actually attended a naval kindergarten together when they were like 5 years old.
Wow.
According to industry legend, she actually once hit Jim over the head with a hammer when they were in kindergarten together at 5 years old.
Well,
so
what were the chances?
That adds a whole nother weird level of quote unquote coincidence to this story, because not only did here you have these two people who had known each other 20 years ago, and now all of a sudden they both simultaneously arrive in Laurel Canyon. He as a larger-than-life rock star, and she as the wife of another larger-than-life rock star, all connected through military intelligence circles. And, what are the odds that just happened by chance?
Well, exactly. And John Phillips of the Mamas and Papas, there's some background there as well?
Yeah, there's some background there as well. Yeah, his dad was a career Marine Corps officer, and his entire family was military connected. His mother, his sister, and his first wife were all career employees of the Pentagon, the Defense Department. And his first wife was also, by the way, named Susie Adams, was also a direct descendant of John Adams, America's second president. So he married, his first marriage was like into royal bloodline, so to speak. And his entire family was military connected, other than him, of course, but But, even he went to West Point and was being prepped, for a military career. There's so many of these people that have military connections that
well, exactly. It gets to the point where you find it difficult to find one of these prominent artists that doesn't have a family background connected to military intelligence or the government in some way. It's almost without exception, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's the real challenge, is finding, if you look at these bands, like these bands that I reeled off, the people who were viewed as sort of the leaders, the creative force, or who emerged as the biggest stars from those bands, like David Crosby from the Byrds and Stephen Stills from Buffalo Springfield, and Frank Zappa from the Mothers of Invention, and Jim Morrison from the Doors, and John, on and on and on. You go through the list and you find repeatedly that that they are sons and daughters of career military officers or intelligence operatives. Like time and time again, it's pretty remarkable, and even where there's not explicit information available, explaining who these parents were, because sometimes it's kind of covered up and swept under the rug, so to speak. But even where there's not explicit recognition that they were in fact military people or military intelligence people, there are very obvious clues that their parents weren't necessarily who they appeared to be. Like Graham Parsons' stepdad, who raised him, because his real dad committed suicide supposedly early on, but it actually looked like a murder. But that's a whole nother story. I mean, there's all kinds of those, all kinds of curious deaths running through the book as well, but that's a whole nother topic. But anyway, his stepdad, who raised him, was very, very deeply involved in training Cuban expatriate groups in the Florida Everglades to overthrow the Castro regime. And, I think we all know who was funding and directing those efforts. So, I mean, even though it doesn't specifically say in the literature that his dad was a CIA contract guy, I mean, he quite obviously was. I'm sure he wasn't just freelancing as a, guy training expatriate Cubans. So, it's very hard to find anyone in that crowd that does not appear to come among the prominent, the most prominent members, the people who became like the superstars. Very, very difficult to find someone who does not appear to come from that background.
It raises questions about, was this something that was being done creatively by these artists expressing themselves in an artistic way, or was the whole thing a pre-planned project operating to an agenda? And this is going to shatter the illusions and the dreams of so many people that kind of grew up in that era. Those of us that weren't a part of that can only reflect on how difficult it must be to kind of embrace the suggestion that it might not have been all that it's been presented to us as. But the evidence would appear to suggest that that could well be the case.
I mean, it's hard to explain it all away. I mean, the fact that so many of these people had came from military intelligence families, that they all just congregated initially for no apparent reason in the same spot that just also happened to house a military intelligence facility, and that the scene came together so quickly, and these bands just. These were not, these were not bands that were being signed by indie upstart labels. I mean, that's another thing. If this was a grassroots kind of organic movement, why is it that it was all of the big corporate entities that were signing and promoting these bands? I mean, it was labels like Capitol and Columbia that were quickly signing and putting out albums by these bands, and it was mainstream radio and the mainstream press that was promoting them. And I mean, if you look at this was not being done through like underground channels. Like these were people that were like on college radio and getting written up in the underground press and whatnot. Right from the start, it were the titans of industry that got behind this movement and that bankrolled it and signed these artists and set them up with equipment and, like I said, recording space and rehearsal space, and the more you look at it, the more the pieces just don't seem to fit together as this organic, grassroots movement that was, a thorn. And also, there's the fact that this movement was supposedly a big thorn in the side of the establishment.
Yeah.
These were people who were, causing trouble for the powers that be and rocking the boat. And yet all of the people that were behind, all of the money that was behind them was corporate money. And all of the tools that the state had at its disposal to silence these people or intimidate them in various ways, they opted not to use, which is another thing that doesn't really quite fit, is why, when there was a draft going on and the majority of the people making up this scene were young draft age males, were none of their careers in, their fans were getting drafted left and right from all across the country.
Right.
But not one of these people had their career interrupted, and there was a military draft in effect throughout the years that this scene played out, which is supposedly why the scene was playing out to begin with, as a response to the war and whatnot.
Maybe they were doing their work unbeknown to them. They were doing a different kind of work for the system.
It seems that way. I mean, it really does, and the fact that the police, gave these people a free hand, despite the fact that they were, not only openly using, but openly promoting, and at times wholesale trafficking drugs through the area, and yet the police pretty much turned a blind eye to all of that. So there are certainly ways that the state could have stepped in and made trouble for these artists, if these artists were in fact causing trouble for them. And it would not have required any heavy-handed approach. All it would have required was was not letting them skate by on their draft notices, which repeatedly happened. I mean, they received draft notices, but they all managed to get deferments in various ways.
Yeah.
And it's always written off as, he got a deferment, but he didn't take a shower for a couple of days, and he went into the draft board and acted crazy, or he did this or that. And I mean, come on, every kid in the country was pulling that shit in the 1960s, trying to avoid the draft, but it didn't work for them, but it always seemed to work for these guys, repeatedly, time after time after time. They managed to avoid the draft, and they managed to avoid getting arrested or serving any time for their numerous, criminal offenses that they were known to be committing, quite openly. So, so there's a lot of problems with the view that this was, an organic movement, and a movement that was positioned to the status quo.
So this leaves the suggestion that it was an exercise in social engineering and sort of mass mind control of the public, and particularly young people, the young people that will be following these bands and these artists. And I think the idea was to get young people turning on, tuning in and dropping out, so to speak, because this went hand in hand with LSD culture that seemed to kind of coincide with this whole movement. Timothy Leary and everything that he was doing. He's admitted that he was a part of the CIA, working for the CIA. And the idea seems to have been to get young people who might otherwise have been objecting to the Vietnam War and going on protest marches and all of this, instead just becoming hippies and chilling out and getting groovy and listening to this music and getting stoned.
Yeah, exactly. And Leary was actually there in the earliest years of Laurel Canyon. Had a home there for a while, and was involved. And I mean, his whole ethos was tune in, turn on, drop out. And I mean the hippie ideal really, basically what the message from the hippies was basically, you can't fix the world, so the best you can do is kind of create your own, and go off and create your own little commune, create your own little slice of paradise, and don't worry about what's going on in the rest of the country, the rest of the world, which is fine for your little group, but that's not the way to affect real social change in society, by withdrawing into your own little your own little meditation group or whatever. And that was basically the message, just drop out. You can't fix it. Just drop out and create your own little ideal community.
Great way of disengaging large numbers of young people from activism.
Exactly. That is the way I see it. I mean, the way we're supposed to see it is that the hippies were the activists, but I see it as a way to absolutely to sabotage activism.
Yeah. And at the same time as all these music artists hanging out in Laurel Canyon, there are a bunch of up-and-coming Hollywood, or Hollyweird, as some people call it, actors that were hanging out there as well, I believe. Was that the likes of Dennis Hopper and Peter Fonda? Would it be people like that?
Correct. It was the what are generally termed the Young Turks, which was Peter Fonda and his I guess you could call them Turkettes, Jane Fonda and Bruce Dern, Jack Nicholson. Who else was kind of part of that? I know I'm forgetting people. Sharon Tate was one of them, and just sort of this young posse of hot Hollywood up and coming actors who later became these huge stars, and they were also very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. In fact, Peter Fonda, I'm sure most people don't know this, but Peter Fonda felt himself so much a part of the scene that he actually recorded an entire solo folk rock album of his own folk rock tunes, which probably mercifully was never released. So I couldn't really tell you how good it was. But they were very much a part of the scene, and a number of the kind of cult films, these sort of strange films from the 60s, like Easy Rider and The Trip and The Monkey's Head, were very much products of Laurel Canyon and the various characters, the intermingling of the rock stars and the young actors who all kind of hung out together and partied together and worked together, in various ways. I mean, Easy Rider was very much a Laurel Canyon movie. The two key figures. Dennis Hopper is basically playing David Crosby. His character is modeled on David Crosby, and Peter Fonda's is modeled on either Graham Parsons or Roger McGowan of the Byrds, depending on who's telling the story. And all of most of the music was all provided by Laurel Canyon bands, Steppenwolf and whatnot. And very closely.
Love that movie, so iconic in so many
ways.
Very
very closely tied to the scene. The Trip, which is supposed to be a cinematic version of an acid trip, actually filmed in a home in Laurel Canyon. And the movie The Head, the Monkees movie Head, actually also very very closely connected to that scene. And both of those, by the way, I don't know how many people know this, but both of those movies, The Trip and Head, were both written by Jack Nicholson. Strangely enough, I'm sure a lot of people don't know
that. I didn't know that.
That he began his career, as a screenwriter of these sort of psychedelic, trippy hippie movies.
And I think both Head and Easy Rider featured a young Tony Basil, who went on to do Mickey years later. I think she was in both those movies.
I did not know that. I mean, obviously Jack Nicholson was in Easy Rider as well. I mean, he was very much a part of that scene, and all of them as well.
Crazy. There's more connections there.
Sharon Tate's dad, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tate, U.S. Air Force Intelligence. Dennis Hopper acknowledged before his death that his dad had been an intelligence operative all the way back to the OSS days. The pre-CIA. His dad was a career intelligence operative. He acknowledged it himself. And Peter and Jane Fonda's dad did Navy intelligence work. Henry Fonda did Navy intelligence work during World War II, and he was connected to through marriage. He was connected to very high-level members of the Mussolini regime and to the Rothschild family, actually. Wow. So, Henry Fonda may not have been the warm and cozy liberal that we're
American
all
guy.
to be.
Yeah, it's very rare I do one of these podcasts without the name Rothschild popping up somewhere. They do seem to get around.
Really? Yeah. Well, every conspiracy meme pops up in this story, whether it's the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, I don't even know where to begin. You know, they're all Skull and Bones is in there. Bruce Dern's uncle, I believe, was a prominent Skull and Bonesman, and his step parents were Eleanor Roosevelt and Adlai Stevenson or something. He had deep political connection, or he's still alive. You know, so again, you know, virtually every one of the Young Turks, you know, you can find the same curious, you know, deep political and intelligence connections, and yeah, all these names that, you know, that are sprinkled throughout the conspiracy community, they pop up over and over and over again, you know.
Didn't you say one of the prominent studio producers for many of these musicians was called Paul Rothchild? I think you said that in another interview.
Paul Rothchild, yeah, spelled without the S.
So we don't know if he's a bona fide Rothschild, or if he's adopted the name, or if he's not.
According to all official accounts, he was not a Rothschild, but, you know, I wouldn't rule it out. You know, I mean, I don't make that claim in the book because, according to all official accounts, he is not a Rothschild, and the name is spelled differently. But that doesn't always mean that, you know, that you can't always rely on that. As I've, you know, pointed out in a recent interview, you know, the current topic that I've been working on is the Lincoln assassination and John Wilkes Booth, and recently found out that Claire Luce Booth, who spells the Booth on her name with an E, and, you know, was obviously a very, you know, very widely regarded as an intelligence operative, as was her husband, Henry Luce, who founded Time and Life and Sports Illustrated and I don't know what else. You know, very much regarded as a CIA couple, and he was Skull and Bones as well, actually, Henry Luce. And you know, I found out very, very recently that, lo and behold, she is actually a descendant of the very same Booth family as John Wilkes Booth, but her branch of the family added the E onto it many generations ago to try to conceal that fact, so that she would not be connected to it. So it's not unheard of. It's not unheard of for these people to, you know, to use different variations in spelling in their names and stuff to throw people off the scent. But do I have any concrete evidence that he was, in fact, a member of the, you know, the Rothschilds? No, I do not. Yeah. But, you know, it's possible. That's
I remember John C. Reilly's character in the movie Boogie Nights, the Paul Thomas Anderson movie, was Reed Rothschild. He played a porn star called Reed Rothschild, without the S again. So that was an interesting choice of name for that movie. I couldn't help thinking.
Yeah, I saw that movie. I don't remember that movie was basically a you know, Hollywoodized version of a brutal quadruple murder that occurred in Laurel Canyon, you know, on Lookout Mountain. You know, the story's told much more literally in the movie Wonderland with Val Kilmer. But yeah, the Boogie Nights contained a very, very stylized version of it, and yeah, that was one of the you know, and as I said earlier, that's another thing that doesn't quite fit with this scene, is all of the violent deaths that were so closely associated with it. And
well, yeah, I mean, the Sharon Tate murders are obviously the ones that spring to mind straight away.
Those are the two, you know, prime examples. Was the you know, the 5 victims murdered on Cielo Drive that actually occurred in Benedict Canyon, a couple few canyons over, but virtually all of the people involved, both victims and perpetrators, were very much a part of the Laurel Canyon scene. You know, Folger and Frykowski were actually living on Woodrow Wilson Drive, right across the road from Mama Cass's house, and Jay Sebring was very closely tied to the scene. He was the guy that was credited with creating Jim Morrison's iconic hairdo, you know, his Alexander the Great hair. And he was a business partner of John Phillips. And, you know, Sharon Tate frequently hung out in Laurel Canyon she was friends with Mama Cass, and John Phillips was known to be a frequent visitor to their homes. And so all of the people, although the murders occurred in Benedict Canyon, all of the people, you know, and Manson and his followers were Laurel Canyon regulars too. So very closely connected. And then the second one was the quadruple Wonderland murders, which occurred right in the heart of Laurel Canyon. So those are just the two most notorious acts of violence that were very closely associated with that whole scene.
Yeah,
There
it's
were
all very
very
strange.
many others.
Yeah. What happened to the whole Laurel Canyon community then as the 60s turned into the 70s? Did it just kind of dissolve and disintegrate and everyone gradually moved away and started sowing their musical seeds elsewhere? I mean, how did it all
Yeah,
kind of break down and dissipate?
just sort of started to dissolve. It would appear like in the mid '70s. For one thing, cocaine came flooding in there and just really changed the whole vibe of the canyon. Um, from the communal pot smoking hippies to these frenzied, insane cokeheads, and really, according to various accounts, really kind of just destroyed the whole vibe that had been there.
Mm.
I don't know if that's the principal reason. I think there was probably a lot of reasons. It had served its purpose, and everyone kind of moved on basically. But yeah, it really had its heyday through the late '60s and into the early '70s, and by like the mid '70s or so, it was pretty dead.
Yeah.
And one of the big problems is that this started out as a club scene, in '65, '66, '67. Um, these bands that were living in Laurel Canyon were regularly pouring out of the canyon on the evenings down onto the Sunset Strip to play all these clubs, which just popped up like mushrooms. In the late 1960s, you just had all of these clubs just popping up out of nowhere. The London Fog and the Whiskey and the Kaleidoscope and Pandora's Box and Beto Litos and just on and on and on. Many long forgotten now. And but what happened is that basically from the Monterey Pop Festival on, which was in 1967, I believe, which is really what kind of introduced this whole Laurel Canyon sound and the British invasion and San Francisco sounds to the rest of the country. And from that point on, these bands were too big to play the clubs. And they very quickly went from clubs to, much larger venues to, venues like the Forum and the Sports Arena here in LA. And, by the time, like I said, these just monster super groups like the Eagles and, Crosby, Stills and Nash and Rumors era Fleetwood Mac and whatnot came along in the early 70s, they'd become so big that they were playing like sports arenas, like 100,000 seat. They had gone from these small intimate clubs to 100,000 seat arenas over the course of just, like 5 years.
Yeah.
And that's what really made the music industry what it is today. This huge albums that never sold that many copies before. Some of these just huge and bands that never played venues anywhere near that size. So in a very, very short period of time, the Laurel Canyon scene really changed the whole commercial face of the music industry, and they'd basically outgrown that entire scene.
What's the neighborhood like now? What sort of place is it now?
If you had waited a few days to do this interview, I could have had a much more complete answer for you.
Yeah, you got this festival coming up, right?
I am going to be spending virtually the entire day there on Sunday. I mean, I don't know if I'm going to make it the entire day because, for one thing, I think it's supposed to be like 93 degrees or something ungodly. And but yeah, there's a 12-hour street fair going on from 11 a.m. to 11 p.m. and I'm going to be there mingling with the locals and hanging out and answering questions. And I mean, I've driven through there a number of times. I've gone on photo missions in there, taking pictures of all of these, formerly, iconic type places, or what's left of them, because, a lot of them are gone. The log cabin's gone, the Houdini mansion, whatnot. So I've spent time there. I've been through there. I've taken pictures there. I've walked through that and whatnot, but I've never really, really kind of hung out for any, like spent a whole day there and mingled with the locals and whatnot. So
Does it
I
still
don't
have a
know,
reputation for being sort of bohemian and kind of, hippie-ish in its
very
feel?
much, very much so. The people, this friend of mine who's a local artist who actually lives there is the one that invited me to participate in this, and she introduced me to the couple of the organizers who look like they're straight out of 1969. One of them's known as Hippie John. That's his name, Hippie John. That's what everybody calls him, apparently.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they kind of still think of themselves to some extent as Latter-day hippies. At least a portion of the locals do. And there's no, there's still some people, Zappa's widow still lives there in his, former home, I believe. And, some stars still come out of there, more recently. I mean, not like real recently, but, Slash, the, guitarist for Guns N' Roses was born and raised there. He kind of grew up there in the 70s during the latter days of the scene, and then emerged as a star in his own right. And one of the guys in the Chili Peppers is, I think, Anthony or Flea, maybe Flea. I think Flea or maybe Kai. I'm not sure. One of those two also grew up, was born and raised there, and then emerged as a star in his own right. And Rick Rubin, I don't think he does anymore, but
The Def Jam guy.
Until fairly recently, he was the occupant of the gigantic mansion that sits just north of the log cabin that was, by industry legend anyway, at one time occupied by Errol Flynn and later by Jimi Hendrix, while he was briefly living in the area. And so it's a home with a Hollywood pedigree, and fairly recently occupied by Rick Rubin, who had a home studio there and recorded. Various artists have recorded there, like System of a Down, I think, and Guns N' Roses actually filmed the video for November Rain at the home on the terrace of this Laurel Canyon home. So there's still some musical presence there to some degree. There's still scattered remnants, I guess you could say, of its former glory.
Yeah. There's something about the 1960s to suggest that the control system really kind of stepped up its game big time in that decade. I mean, when you factor in like JFK, Bobby Kennedy, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, you got the start of the Vietnam War, the Black Panther movement, all the civil rights movements that were going on, LSD, the psychedelic era. So much happened in that decade that changed society and sort of changed the world and was responsible for so many ripples that spread forth. And you look at you look at the 1950s and the 1970s, and there was some stuff going on in those decades, but they were relatively low key by comparison. A lot went on in the 60s, and it seems that decade had been earmarked for massive social change.
Oh, very much. Yeah. I mean, I basically came of age in the 1970s, which was quite possibly the most culturally vapid decade of all time. But yeah, the 60s was, it was a seriously, there was just so much going on with, you had the Black empowerment movement with the Black Panthers. You had the Gray Panthers, fighting for elderly rights. You had the women's liberation movement. You had the anti-war movement. You had leaders being picked off, one by one. JFK, RFK, Martin Luther King, the leaders of the various leaders of the Black Panther movement, were being picked off as well. Malcolm X, it was. It was a very chaotic, tumultuous time where there were all of these forces seemingly working to affect, major social changes, and all of that kind of got eclipsed by the hippies / flower children, and that most people now that is the prevailing image that they have of that era. You know, the hippies kind of symbolize all of that to most people. Whereas from my point of view, the hippies were put in there to really derail all of that and distract away from it. And it worked because, you know, that's what the anti-war movement and the hippies are one and the same in most people's minds, you know, and a lot of the other movements are just all but forgotten. And, you know, they just kind of came along and just sort of became the new face of the 60s, and everything else kind of got pushed to the side.
How do you think it is that the events and the happenings and the people of Laurel Canyon pretty much flew under the radar for the best part of 40 years, you know, because you mentioned the book that you read on holiday, and that kind of spurred you on to do your research, which was around about 2008, I think. So that was like 40 plus years after the scene was in its heyday, and it pretty much flew under the radar in all that time. And now you've resurrected a whole load of new interest in it, and people are joining dots and making connections and saying, oh yeah, you know, we can see how this all fits together now. But nobody seemed to be doing that for 4 decades. You know, it really flew under the radar, this whole thing.
It really is odd, isn't it? I mean, the Grammy Museum right here in LA, in conjunction with the Getty Museum, is just now, as we speak, they are staging an exhibit on the Laurel Canyon scene, first time ever. It opened last month in May, almost in conjunction with the release of my book, which was just so bizarre. You know, my publisher set a release date of April 30th, and as that was like 2 weeks before, I just, you know, I'm reading through the LA Times, and there's an article telling me that the Grammy Museum in a few weeks is going to be staging this exhibit. And they have quotes from, you know, the people, the directors of the museum and whatnot, saying, yeah, you know, well, we've looked at all this other stuff, and we thought it was time to focus some attention right here on our own backyard. And I'm like, well, yeah, why did it take you 45 years to do it? You know?
Yeah.
So, yeah, why has this story laid dormant for so long? I mean, from, you know, the mid-'60s to up until, like, 2008, it was almost completely untold. You know, even the mainstream version was unknown, and certainly my version was, you know, completely unknown. But even the mainstream version had been swept under the rug for, you know, almost half a century. That's very strange. You know, that's just very bizarre that it took so long for anyone to pay any attention to this hugely influential scene that had played out.
We seem to be living in an era of truth. You know, truth is just coming to the surface now in so many ways about so many things that have been hidden for so many years. You've got people speculating on new theories of who may have shot JFK. I mean, here in the UK, I know I've been talking with you on the email about this, we've got this whole scenario, this whole fiasco involving Jimmy Savile. I'm sure a lot of folk in the US probably don't even know who Jimmy Savile was. And, you know, he got away with it for over 50 years, but it's all anyone's talking about here now. The whistle is blown on him, his name is dirt, and that's how long it took for the truth to come out. But it does seem to get there in the end. You know, it may take 40, 50 years or more, but the lid is being lifted on so much now that's been hidden.
To some degree, yeah. I mean...
there's more to come, surely.
Yeah, you know, I mean, some of it is just like beating a dead horse to me. You know, I mean, I don't know how many more details of the JFK assassination could be, you know, dredged up at this point. You could fill an entire library with books, you know, challenging the Warren Report and blaming it on, you know, everyone imaginable. Which is one of the reasons that I'm focusing on Lincoln, because, you know, in comparison, there's been 150 years for people to look at Lincoln, and yet
who talks about Lincoln?
You can hardly find a critical analysis of the official Lincoln story, but JFK, my God, that's been beaten to death for 50 years now, and you know, I don't know that there's a lot, you know, I mean, at some point it just becomes muddying the waters in my mind, you know, and I kind of feel the same way about like 911, you know, I think the strongest points of the 911 case were made within the first couple of years, and then since then it's just sort of drifted off into all kinds of speculative stuff about directed energy being weapons and hologram planes and God knows what.
I guess with those two, they're consistent. JFK and 9/11. Ever since those events, people have been speculating on what may or may not have happened. Whereas the Laurel Canyon story was buried for decades. You know, it's only come through in recent times.
Yeah, JFK was controversial right out of the gate, and 911 obviously also, and you know, anything that happens now is you know, people immediately start dogpiling on it, whether it's the Boston Marathon or Sandy Hook or whatever it is. I mean, there's none of these stories are going to remain buried nowadays, but yeah, so. Yeah, the 911 thing. Yeah, so that is a major difference is that this one, you know, wasn't. It's not like this. The story is now, you know, like the dirty details are now emerging. It's the entire story is just now emerging after all of these years. So yeah, it's a very strange case. I would have to say it's
crazy. Yeah.
Very, very, very odd.
And let me ask you, how do you feel about the fact that it's been you as opposed to any other writer that's exposed this story and caused so many people to view that whole sort of era with a new perspective? I mean, it could have been any number of researchers that did it, and it was you. And I wonder if you feel in any way that it was kind of fated, that this was to be your defining work, this was to be what you did with your life, or do you not go in for that way of looking at things?
I don't know. You know, I'm very proud of the work that I've done. You know, I mean, when I first started this, when I first reported that you know who Jim's dad actually was, which had been completely buried for 45 years, and no one it had never been in print. And you know, when I first put it out, I got blasted from all directions. People were challenging it, saying, "What's your source for this?" I've run extensive searches, and I can't find any printed reference material to back you up. And I was saying, I know that because no one's ever put it in print before. That doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means that nobody ever put it in print before, you know. And so, you know, I took a lot of heat for that. And then strangely enough, a couple of years later, the admiral, who was still alive up until a few years ago, passed away. And only then, in his obituaries, did the mainstream media finally report that he was, in fact, exactly who I said he was. And which was kind of cool because it all of a sudden gave me a credibility that I didn't have before. And some of a lot of my critics kind of quietly you know, retreated back into wherever it was they came from, you know, and that you know, that's one of the things that really lit a fire under this story, was that. So I'm very proud of it to a large degree. People tell me all the time, you know, hey, thanks for completely ruining the 60s for me, or thanks for ruining the Doors for me. I can't listen to my favorite band anymore, you know. And I'm like, you know, I'm sorry, I don't know what to tell you.
Well,
you know,
the truth is the truth, and it doesn't care whether you like it or not. It carries on being the truth.
Whether it's faded, I mean, I've been accused of that. You know, people have basically kind of tried to paint this as like I was handed this story by I don't know who, my handlers, I guess. I don't know, for lack of a better word, specifically to position me as sort of the reigning authority, the go-to guy on rock and roll conspiracies, specifically so that I could then, be the disinformation agent, you know, in the, or some, people have painted these bizarre scenarios, not true, you know. I mean, of course, I'm going to deny that. People have to draw their own conclusions, but you know, I've certainly been accused of that. But you know, whether it was, I don't know. I have no idea why I am the person who broke this story. I really don't. I'm very proud of the work that I've done. I think I'm very proud of the book. I'm very proud of the way it came out, and you know, people are going to draw whatever conclusions they're going to draw. But, you know, I know what my motivations are, so that's all
you're nobody in this game until somebody calls you out as a shill. It comes with the territory.
I have been called controlled opposition, a limited hangout artist, a shill, a fraud, a fake, a phony, you name it. It's
CIA insider.
on my own Facebook page, a disinformation
Yeah.
tard. That was my favorite one, disinformation tard. That's what
Oh yeah.
I couldn't even begin to tell you all the names that I've been called on my own page, and some of them are still on there. I try to maintain a free speech zone, but there are limits, you know.
Well, exactly.
One person actually started dragging my 80-year-old mother and my daughter into it, which I drew the line there and banned them because they have nothing whatsoever to do with this, and I thought that was just way out of line.
Exactly.
But for the most part, I'll let people have their say. You know, they can accuse me of whatever they want. It's, you know, that's...
We've got the very important thing to do of telling people where they can get hold of the book. And I think you'd probably like to recommend some non-Amazon sources for the book. So let people know where they can find it.
Well, I mean, my first preference is to get it directly from me on my website, where I am selling signed copies, which is www.davesweb.cnchost.com is the homepage. If that's too hard to remember, you can just Google my name, and it'll generally be the first link that comes up, or Google the Center for an Informed America. And once you get to my homepage, you will see various links to the book order page prominently placed around my page. And yeah, I am selling single copies and multiple copies of Program to Kill, and also my previous book, I'm selling Weird Scenes. I'm sorry. My previous book, Program to Kill, I'm also selling either singly or in a discounted combo package with the Weird Scenes book. So I have various options available to purchase either one separately or together. And can't quite compete with Amazon because they're pretty brutal with their pricing policies, but I'm doing the best I can. And I'll also be selling them actually in Laurel Canyon, of course, on Sunday, although that doesn't really benefit anyone that's not in the LA area. But for actually less than what Amazon is selling them for, because there won't be any postage or PayPal costs. But like I said, that really only benefits people who might happen to be in the LA area. So the best way to get it is through the order page on my trusty website, my very primitive, never updated website is, that would be my first preference. And if not, then buy it from your local bookstore. Support your local bookstore. They are a dying breed, and they need to be supported before Amazon crushes them all out of existence.
Yep, indeed. And your work on the Lincoln assassination, that's a web series right now, right? That's not a book.
It is. All of my stuff, all of my books actually started as web series, and people actually have asked me if I'm going to turn this one into a book, and I do not, as of now, have any plans to do so. But it's there's 7 parts up. I actually have a part 8 that I'm going to be putting up probably this weekend, and it's almost done, and many more to come. And it's a fascinating topic to me because, like I say, there's so few people that really know anything at all about the Lincoln assassination. There are people throughout the conspiracy community that can talk to you for days on the minutia of the JFK assassination, but virtually no one that really has any kind of detailed knowledge at all on the Lincoln assassination. And it's every bit as fascinating and every bit as bizarre, the cast of characters and the deaths surrounding it and whatnot. There's so many parallels to. It just makes you realize that the more things change, the more they stay the same. And a lot of people like to think that if we could just, a lot of people have these benchmarks. They like to think, well, if we could just roll the clock back to before 9/11, everything was great then, or if we could just roll, if we could just go back to before they took out Kennedy, everything was wonderful then. And, I think what this series offers is, the perspective that things have always been pretty screwed up.
It was messed up then, folks, as well. Yeah.
Yeah, it was messed up. It was messed up well before 911, well before JFK, well before whatever your benchmark is.
Yeah.
Things have not changed all that much from 150 years ago, really.
And with John Wilkes Booth, you get into some of the descendants of the Booth family, and one of them that you mentioned was Sherry Booth, better known as Sherry Blair, the wife of the psychopathic mass-murdering war criminal Tony Blair, which is a bit of a crazy one, isn't it?
It's amazing, isn't it? Yeah, that a direct descendant could in very recent times become I don't know what you call them over there, the First Lady of England. I don't know what you.
There's lots of things she's called, really.
I can imagine. And this hugely influential Claire Booth Luce, who was in fairly contemporary times, and that's just one of the weird things. You don't see like descendants of Lee Harvey Oswald, sitting in the House of Representatives or something like that.
Not really.
That doesn't happen all that often. Or Sirhan's grandson, being a Supreme Court justice or something. You don't really see that. But with the Booth family, they're still very much prominent in both the U.S. and in the U.K. and in various political positions. It's just kind of odd, really. Yeah.
Great to talk to you today. Thanks a lot for joining us.
No problem. Thank you. Then Haight-Ashbury, which was, basically an outgrowth of the initial scene in Laurel Canyon.
Yeah. And the Beach Boys were involved in that as well, you said?
To some extent, they were, yeah. They lived in and around there, and they hung out with the other musicians. Brian Wilson was actually just very, very highly regarded by a lot of the people on the scene. He was pretty much viewed as like the premier musicians, composer, arranger, whatever of that era. Just considered just a massively talented guy. And
they should have maybe been the Canyon Boys. They should call themselves the Canyon Boys.
Their squeaky clean image doesn't exactly fit with the scene, but they were they were bopping around, and I mean a lot of things about the Beach Boys don't really fit in with their squeaky clean image. Like
Charles
Dennis
Manson connections.
Charlie Manson as a house guest for the entire summer of 1968.
There you go. Yeah,
that doesn't quite fit in with their image either.
Not really, no. And where are we picking up the story with all this? We're going back to what, 1964, 65? Would it be?
Yeah, thereabouts. Yeah, 64, 65. I mean, the first band to really make their mark was the Byrds, who I believe were signed and released their first single circa 1965, which was Mr. Tambourine Man. And they were the trailblazers. They were the ones that really started the whole folk rock, revolution, which then quickly split into several other factions: country rock and psychedelic rock, and sort of introspective singer-songwriter genre. And those were all basically pioneered to a large extent in Laurel Canyon.
And so what happened was something drew all these artists and all these collaborators, all these musicians and associates to this particular area, magnet-like, around about that time, 64, 65 onwards. It doesn't appear to have been an organic, grassroots, natural, creative thing. It seems to be that there was some reason why all these people were being directed to this one particular neighborhood.
Correct, yeah. It happened very, very quickly. I mean, just, it does not have the look of you think of a sort of an organic grassroots movement. You think of these struggling artists, playing coffee houses and maybe getting on college radio and, slowly working their way up to, some kind of mainstream acceptance or whatever. And this didn't happen. Even LA natives do not realize that, there was this hugely influential scene here that actually preceded the parallel scene up north.
Yeah. The famous Scott McKenzie song should have maybe been called "If You're Going to Laurel Canyon, Be Sure to Wear Some Flowers in Your Hair," and not San Francisco. That would have been good.
It really, yeah. I mean, because there was this whole vibrant scene there, and just an amazing array of bands. Everyone from the Byrds, Buffalo Springfield, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention, Arthur Lee and Love, the Mamas and the Papas, the Turtles, the Monkees, the Beach Boys, Three Dog Night, Captain Beefheart, various bands that Graham Parsons put together, International Submarine Band, Flying Burrito Brothers, a whole bunch of them that I'm leaving out because it's impossible to remember them all. I always leave out a whole bunch of them. Steppenwolf, Alice Cooper, strangely enough,
really
part of the scene. I mean, just people you wouldn't even expect that they don't even quite seem to fit in, as well as just an array of singers and songwriters. Carole King and Joni Mitchell and Judy Collins and Judy Sill and Jackson Browne and James Taylor. And various songwriters before they kind of made their name for themselves. People like Paul Williams and Warren Zevon. And then in the latter stages, you had all these just giant like super groups come out of the canyon, like Crosby, Stills and Nash, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, the Eagles. Fleetwood Mac was it didn't start out there, but became part of that scene when they added Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. And so some of the biggest albums of all time, like the Hotel California and Rumors and CSN's first album, some of the first albums that just went into the stratosphere were products of the Laurel Canyon scene. So hugely influential scene, with just so many artists that to this day are these iconic household names.
Yeah, really.
I think I forgot the Doors, actually. Jim Morrison and the Doors, of course.
Oh yeah.
And and all kinds of others that I'm forgetting. There's just an amazing array of these hugely successful and talented artists that poured out of that scene and really shaped the musical landscape and the cultural, the youth culture landscape for the 1960s, far more so than with the idea that I was gonna get away from all of the stuff that I normally look into in my day-to-day life. I kind of wanted to just escape all of that and turn off my brain and just kind of roll the clock back. And I figured this would be the perfect light. Beach reading, just conjure up all these great memories of all this music that really provided the soundtrack to my early years. And
it didn't quite work out that way.
It was going to be the perfect escapist entertainment for a vacation, and instead, what I found was that all these alarm bells were going off, and I just could not get through the book quick enough, and just could not wait to get back to my computer and back to somewhere where I could start ordering books and accessing more information on this topic, and that eventually led to what was initially I envisioned as a very short series of web posts, just kind of an interesting diversion from whatever it was I was working on at the time, which I don't even remember what that was. And instead, it just kind of took on a life of its own, and almost immediately started finding an audience, far beyond anything else I'd ever done, any of the other topics I'd ever tackled previously. This one really seemed to resonate with a lot of people, and and so it just grew and grew and grew, and I started getting feedback from people, and people were saying, hey, have you read this article? Have you read this book? Have you checked out this website? And so with a lot of help and feedback from my readers, it just continued to grow and grow and grow into something that I had never really initially envisioned, and then it eventually reached book length, essentially, and then I started getting publication offers. Eventually got 3 of them, the first 2 from U.S. publishers, who both of whom I just did not really get a good vibe from. I mean, I was very skeptical that any publisher would really handle this material in the way that I thought it should be handled, and I have a hard time turning over control of my material to anyone else, which is why I've been very comfortable working on the web, because I have complete editorial control of my material,
Oh, yeah.
And so I was very skeptical, and I passed on the first two offers, and then ultimately got one from a publisher over on your side of the world in London, Head Press. So now it is a book. And it is contains everything that was in the original series and a whole bunch of additional material. Just lots and lots of a new preface, a new foreword. I think 5 new chapters, a new epilogue, a bibliography, an index, and various augmentations of some of the existing chapters. So
okay.
It is the very same story, but greatly expanded and augmented now. And a couple people actually have not realized that I'm the same person that wrote the Inside the LC articles, and have kind of accused me of basically stealing. Hey, didn't you steal this story from that guy on the internet?
So the crux of the story is looking at the hugely disproportionate number of artists, music artists and groups that congregated in the Laurel Canyon community towards the end of the 60s, and this is what was termed the counterculture, sort of anti-establishment, birth of the hippie movement, basically. And as I say, there was just a huge number of artists that, for one reason or another, just seemed to flock to that area, whereas legend and lore has it that the hippie movement was birthed up in San Francisco, in the sort of Haight-Ashbury area of that city, which is not really the case, is it?
No, it's not. And that's one of the strangest things about this story, is that it's only very, very recently, like I said, Michael Walker was really the first one to do a book-length treatment, and there's been a few others, Canyon of Dreams by Harvey Kubernik, and Hotel California by Barney Hoskins, and some of the work by John Einerson and Richie Unterberger and Barry Miles have touched on it, but still to this day, it's a very downplayed, the whole Laurel Canyon scene. And whenever virtually anyone thinks of the 60s and the hippies and the flower children and that whole music and countercultural scene, their mind immediately goes to Haight-Ashbury, which is viewed as the birthplace and the spiritual center of the whole hippie movement. And yeah, that's one of the great myths, because it actually began down here a couple of years earlier and was a much, much bigger scene, just spawned a mind-boggling number of bands and solo artists that, far more than San Francisco produced, and it was here that, the hairstyles, the clothing styles, all of the things that would become the trademarks of the hippies and the flower children all actually began here. And that, even that aspect of the story is really unknown by even people living, like me and all the people that I grew up with. Nobody, most people in LA.
So welcome to Good Vibrations. We're up to volume 43. Welcome back to all the regulars, and welcome to all new listeners. You might want to go back and check out some of the previous volumes. We've covered all kinds of alternative subjects that you don't normally hear talked about elsewhere, from chemtrails to paedophilia in the British establishment, natural law to reincarnation to astral projection, occult symbolism in music, and visual clues in the movies of Stanley Kubrick, to name but a few. We're taking it back to music today, which is, the thing that's close to my heart, and also the guest that we have on. And we're chatting with author and researcher and fellow lifelong music fan and LA dweller, Dave McGowan. Welcome along, Dave.
Well, thank you for having me.
So you, of course, are the writer of the series of web articles that were titled Inside the LC, The Strange but Mostly True Story of Laurel Canyon and the Birth of the Hippie Generation. And we've now got the book, which has just been launched, Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon, all about the community, the neighborhood in Los Angeles of Laurel Canyon, and some of the stuff that has gone on there in music legend and music lore. So do you just want to start out by telling us what first put you on the path to examining the activities at Laurel Canyon from back in the day?
It was entirely accidental. I've gotten, people that have followed my interviews have probably heard this story way more times than they want to, but basically I've been, researcher and blogger, whatnot for since going on 20 years now, since like I think my first website went up in 1997. My first book was published in either 99 or 2000.
Okay.
So, I've been looking in the dark corners of the conspiracy world for quite a while now, and I'm pretty familiar with a lot of rather dark and ominous topics.
Sure.
And but stumbling upon Laurel Canyon was entirely accidental. I grew up here. I've lived here my entire life. I was born in 1960, so I was a very young lad when all of this played out. I had no awareness of it at the time, but I was geographically right here in the area while it was playing out, but had no awareness of it at all. And anyway, back in 2007, 2008, my daughter had gotten me a copy of Michael Walker's book, Laurel Canyon, which had just come out, brand new in 2007, which was really the first mainstream treatment of the Laurel Canyon scene. And I was very interested to read it and took it with me when I went on vacation.